Hey everyone, welcome back to another installment of Quarantine History. This video and the next video, we will be dealing with two presidents. We will be looking at the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Um, this video will look at the domestic side, and then the second video will look at the foreign policy side of their presidencies. Where we left off at the end of 1801 was that Richard Nixon had resigned from the presidency. He resigned over the Watergate scandal, um, which brought Gerald Ford into the presidency. And if you remember from the video, Gerald Ford is the answer to a trivia question. He is the only president to never be elected, either vice president or president. Ford ascended to the presidency through resignations. He was nominated, he became vice president after Nixon's vice president Spiro Agnew resigned, and then he became president when Nixon resigned. Nixon resigned in early August of 1974. So that means Ford will have, he finishes out the rest of Nixon's term at least. So he has the rest of 74, all of 75, and all of 76 to serve as president, which is ends up being about 2.5 years. And so if you look at it, he sort of is in the White House the same amount of time as John Kennedy is. Kennedy only serves about 2.5 years. So, Section 2, as you can see, is titled the Ford and Carter years. Like I mentioned, Ford becomes vice president with the resignation of Spiro Agnew, and then president when Nixon himself resigns. Things are basically the same economically under Ford as they were under Nixon. The economy was not doing well. Things don't automatically change just because Gerald Ford becomes president. But the economy is not doing well because of stagflation. You have inflation and recession happening at the same time. You still have America and Vietnam at this time. You still have problems with oil and OPEC. However, one of the first things Gerald Ford needs to do as president is he needs a vice president. And his vice president is going to be the former governor of New York. His name is Nelson Rockefeller, and he is from that famous Rockefeller family of New York. Ford's presidency, in my opinion, ends 1 month after it starts. Because in September of 1974, Gerald Ford will do something that angered a majority of Americans. Gerald Ford will grant an all-encompassing pardon to Richard Nixon. He basically went on national TV and told the American public that I am pardoning Richard Nixon for anything he did and did not do. A lot of people wanted Richard Nixon to be brought to trial for, obstruction of justice, lying, even, conspiracy to commit different crimes. And a lot of Americans were bent on putting Richard Nixon on trial and eventually in jail. Gerald Ford basically said that wouldn't be good for America, both at home and abroad. If all of a sudden one president is put on trial, how many others could be put on trial, even though, Nixon did commit some crimes. From a foreign policy standpoint, it wouldn't look good if a former American president is in jail. What would that say to the rest of the world? 1 month he's president of the United States, and the next month he's, under arrest. What does that say? So Gerald Ford did what he could do as president, and he granted a pardon for any federal crime that Nixon may or may not have done. A president cannot pardon anyone for a state or local crime, only for federal crimes. And the American public was not happy about it, like I said. And as a result, in the midterm elections in November, just 2 months later of 1974, you have one of the worst congressional elections for one party in the history of American politics. 48 Republicans were kicked out of Congress. That was the worst one until 2018, when a number of Republicans were kicked out in favor of Democrats in the 2018 elections. So this was a big deal. Americans were basically telling Ford, we're not happy with what you did, and if you want to win in 76, you better do some big things between now and November of 76. He tries to help the economy, but it doesn't work. He tried to start something called WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. And basically, it was a voluntary approach for businesses to try and improve the economy. And the key word in that is voluntary. Obviously, it wasn't good for a business, so they weren't going to do it. Whatever it may be. Lower prices, lower demand, whatever they could do, because it wasn't mandated or required, and because this is capitalist society. Most businesses said, yeah, we're not doing that. Here's the front page of the Washington Post. You can see Ford grants Nixon full pardon, says he has, quote unquote, suffered enough. And that angered a lot of Americans. Now, that'll lead us to the election of 1976. Ford will serve out the rest of his election, or the rest of his term, excuse me. Ford also carries the I don't know if it's positive or not. Obviously, it's not. But Gerald Ford had 2 assassination attempts on his life within a week. Both were by women, and both happened, I think, on the West Coast. He was doing a tour of the West Coast, and I think they both happened in California. But either way, Gerald Ford will not win election in 1976. He is going up against a man named Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter at the time was the former governor of Georgia, not known nationally, but you can see from the map, Carter gets enough of the electoral vote, and the popular vote was, a coin flip. Carter was able to win enough bigger states, obviously Texas, and he got into the north. He got into New York. He got into Pennsylvania. So you can see the divide between Ford and Carter. Jimmy Carter, who's pictured here, in 76 basically ran as a political outsider. He told Americans around the country, I wasn't in Washington during Watergate. I wasn't really even politics during Watergate. Yes, Ford wasn't around for Watergate, but he was Nixon's VP. He could have told Nixon to do things differently, and he didn't. So how can you trust someone like that? Jimmy Carter was also a born-again Christian. So religion was making a comeback after the sort of the debauchery of the 60s and early 70s, the counterculture movement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Some Americans were going back to religion, and they wanted these services and these beliefs put back into American society, and they believed Carter could do it. The one thing that sort of helped Carter get elected will hurt him as president, and that is he didn't have any friends in Washington, D.C. When he was running for president, he said, I have no allies in Washington, D.C. I am not a Washington, D.C. insider. That was good, got him elected, but then when he got into office, he didn't have anyone to help him. He couldn't go to Congressman whoever or Senator whoever and say, hey, I need help getting this bill passed. What can you do for me? And so that hurt him throughout his presidency. Jimmy Carter will also do something very early in his presidency, the actual first day, his first full day as president, that ultimately hurt him with a lot of Americans. Jimmy Carter, the first day as president, granted amnesty to the people who dodged the Vietnam War draft. What that meant was that they could come home. Uh, Dodging the draft was a crime. If you were drafted into military service and you don't report, that is a crime. You can be arrested. A lot of people, hid within the United States. They fled the country. They went to Canada or wherever. And if they were to come back, they would be arrested. Jimmy Carter, trying to put the Vietnam War behind the United States, basically said, look, if you did it, if you dodged the draft, if you ran away, if you're in hiding, come home. The war is over. We're putting it behind us. And, depending on your opinion on that, a good number of Americans were angry about that. Some people said, hey, I got drafted and went. I didn't want to go. That's not fair. Or, hey, I know someone who got drafted, went, died, or came back, injured or whatever. That's not fair that someone else commits a crime by dodging the draft and they get to come home without any consequences. So this hurt Jimmy Carter right off the bat. He's also hurt domestically by two things that hurt both Nixon and Ford. The economy. Stagflation will continue into the late 70s. The oil crisis, the energy crisis happens during this time. So some of the same issues are around for almost a decade here. Now, the values of Americans are starting to change in the mid to late 70s. A lot of it has to do with sort of I don't know if you want to call it the backlash to the counterculture of the 60s, the hippies, sex, drugs, rock and roll, things like that, or the people involved, grew up, in their late teens and early 20s, fast forward 10, 15 years, and now you're in your 30s or 40s. And so when you're in that age, you think differently than you did when you were in your late teens, early 20s. So, Americans begin to move to places called the Sun Belt and the suburbs. The Sun Belt is basically your lower half of the United States. Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arizona, places like that. And Americans are moving out of your cities. They're moving into suburban areas. Because more people are moving to the Sun Belt, these places start to get political power. And you start to see states like Florida and Arizona get more in the congressional piece. You start to see the presidents come from that area. Most of your presidents in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s are coming from the Sun Belt. They're not coming from, New York or Pennsylvania, even though our current, our last two presidents, Obama and Trump, technically came from this area. Obama from Illinois and Trump from New York. So, we're starting to see a switch back maybe, but who knows. But during this time, the 70s, people are moving. The American immigrant is changing. No longer is it mostly European, it is now Asian and Latin American. So you're seeing people from Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and other places. Families change. Divorce rates get higher. So now you're starting to see, half siblings, step siblings, step parents, families. The face of the American family is changing. No longer is it mostly, the mom, dad, and 2.5 kids. The nuclear family of the 50s and 60s. The 70s was known as the me decade because Americans became very self-centered. Very, similar to now. Everything, Snapchat, Instagram, everything's about you, what I did, what I did, what I did. In the 70s, people start to run. They start to eat better. They start to exercise. It was all about self-improvement. So that's why the 70s were dubbed the me decade. So that's it for Ford and Carter on a domestic level. We will deal with them on a foreign policy level next time. Until then, be good.